I want to just give thanks to Lee Morris for that video. Lee doesn't live here locally. She's a musician up in the Washington, D.C. area, but she's been producing a lot of audiovisual pieces for UU congregations around the country and sharing those with us. And I am really grateful for that. I also want to just give a bit of a note this morning about our meditation on breathing song that we sing every week. I shared this in a message, a written message with some folks in the congregation on Friday being September 11th. That song, Meditation on Breathing, that we sing each week is just the chorus to a much longer song that was written by UU musician and composer Sarah Dan Jones just following the events of September 11th, 2001. So as we sing it and knowing that background, I carry a slightly different meaning and orientation when we sing that song. To think that even in that moment, after those horrific incidents 19 years ago, someone could use their imagination to write a new song about breathing in peace and breathing out love. And that today, 19 years later, we are singing that song to help keep us grounded, to remind us that we can return to that peace and love in the midst of whatever is happening in our lives and in our world. I'm grateful for that gift of that song to us. So I want to give you a heads up that at least once during my brief reflection this morning, I'm going to ask you to use the chat so we can have a little bit of interaction and back and forth communication this morning. First, I want to tell you about a professor that I had in seminary. I've been out of seminary now for 10 years, so this was at least 12 years ago. He was someone who often encouraged us to use our spiritual imaginations, and that was a phrase he used, spiritual imaginations. Now, this professor was and still is a Methodist minister of Chinese origin who grew up in Malaysia. And he is someone that for years and years has also been a significant and powerful witness and ally for LGBTQ folks within the Methodist denomination, as well as a really committed worker for racial justice. And I think about him as someone who in his body and in his life story crossed many different kinds of boundaries, right? Well, he happened to teach the Hebrew Bible. So in my classes with him, as we read these old stories, we engaged in lots of ways of approaching and studying those texts. And he is someone who had devoted his whole career to understanding where these stories came from in their geographic and historical context. There were times when we were studying archaeology in my Old Testament Hebrew Bible class with him. He is someone who had studied Greek and Hebrew and could talk about how texts have been translated or mistranslated over the centuries. He talked with us about how biblical texts that we think of as in the canon, so to speak, these days, were compiled and how some things got left out. He helped us think about what the message of those stories might have meant in their original context and how they sometimes get misused in a context of today. But in the end, as pastors and preachers, he pointed us to our imaginations to open up the meaning in a story. Using our imaginations, we were able to cross lines of history and culture and language and enter into a human story as a human being. Now, back then, as I was preparing to become a Unitarian Universalist minister, I was exploring the place of Christianity and biblical texts in my own life and faith. Even as someone who had not grown up in a Christian tradition of reading the Bible literally, I still was seeking for a place for it in my life and meaning making. This professor and many others helped me to see and to understand a much wider way to read scripture, one that opened up many different possibilities and many different possible meanings. It was a way that allowed us to play with words and play with applications to our lives today, our real lived experiences. It certainly relied on metaphor for meaning making. And this, it turns out, was really good preparation by a Methodist for a Unitarian Universalist minister. And I'm also remembering that quite a few of my classmates back then did come out of traditions that said there's only one way to read the Bible and only one possible meaning, and all other possible interpretations are false. I know some of you grew up in similar traditions, and often these traditions make other really sharp lines and distinctions between who is good and who is bad, who is saved and who is lost, who is God and who is definitely not God, what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. It is a framework of dualistic either-or thinking. For some of my classmates coming from more fundamentalist backgrounds, it was scary to open up their faith tradition to multiple possibilities and multiple interpretations. What could be relied on? How could you know what is true? How could you be sure of anything? I recently had the opportunity to hear Reverend Nadia Boltz Weber speak on Zoom, of course. I'm not sure if everyone here would know who she is. She's the tattooed Lutheran pastor who started this community in Denver called the House for All Saints and Sinners. And her most recent book is called Shameless, A Sexual Reformation. So that gives you a little tiny hint, if you don't know her, about who she is. Anyhow, in this talk I heard her give, she talked a bit about growing up in a very fundamentalist Christian tradition, getting angry about it when it rubbed up against her lived experience of the world, and rejecting it for a long time, but eventually coming back around to a different understanding of and living out of the Christian tradition. She's talked with many different people over the years who have been hurt or damaged in fundamentalist churches. And she told the story about one person who asked her, how did you get past your anger? How did you know you had actually moved on, that your fundamentalist upbringing no longer had a hold on you? And her answer was this, and I'm paraphrasing. She said, when I was able to hold both the gifts and the damage that tradition brought to me side by side, I knew I had moved on. when I was able to approach that tradition, that fundamentalist tradition, outside of the dualistic framework it had given me, to know that it was not all good, but it was not all bad either. Then I was able to move on and be free from it. Fundamentalisms of all kinds, whether it's Christian fundamentalism or a fundamentalist expression of a different religious tradition, or a fundamentalism about some other kind of ideology, fundamentalisms, as well as our dominant white Western culture overall, want us to choose, push us to pick a side, and ask us to hold on very tightly to whatever we choose with certainty, to pick either this or that and to not change. So here's where I need your help. Let's think about this kind of dualistic thinking and how it is showing up not just in our culture right now, but in ourselves. Where do you find yourself right now pushed into either or thinking? And it's not a rhetorical question. I'm asking you to share in the chat. I'll share some ways that I see it showing up in myself and in our culture too. You are either male or female. You are either red or blue. You are good or you are not good. We think of people more and more as friend or foe, mask wearer or not, rich or poor, success or failure, Christian or not, true Christian or not, Trump supporter or not, selfish or not, white or not white, old or young, for the environment or a polluter, happy or not happy, a patriot or not a patriot. You either support the police or you don't. You're either a racist or you're absolutely not. Our world is doomed or everything will be just fine. So we could go on. I'm seeing more come in on the chat. So these are dualities where we are forced to choose one or the other, and it's very hard to be both or to let there be room to be both. For Unitarian Universalists, using our imagination as a spiritual practice is one that calls us to wake up to more possibilities beyond those either or dualities and choices. I mean, this is really rooted in our history of faith, how we think of faith development and becoming a mature spiritual person. Our approach to that is much more about asking questions than about being taught or told the answers. So what if both things on an either or spectrum are true at once? What if there's a third or a fourth possibility or a fifth or a 10th possibility we haven't even yet considered because we haven't let ourselves imagine it? As Lee Morris asked in our wisdom story this morning, who can I be? What can I see? In this great world, who could be free? When things get uncertain and chaotic, like they are right now in our world, many of us, myself included, seek to hold on to something for certainty. It is just too uncomfortable to not know what is happening or what will happen or how to control the outcome. But oh, this grasping and holding on for certainty is, I think, friends, what is separating us and keeps us from a wider freedom. When we think, and I want us to really drop down into ways that liberal folks and progressive folks can do this. When we think there's only one right way, don't we get controlled and boxed in ourselves? When we define who we are by saying we're not that, don't we get controlled by that thing which we are rejecting? It's like Nadia, before she found freedom from her religious upbringing, she could only define herself as not that. Now she can say, that experience is a part of who I am, and I still carry parts of it with me. And I am also now this other identity that I have grown into. It is her imagination outside of that either or that allowed this tattooed woman who talks about sex a lot to become a Lutheran pastor, right? She had to imagine that possibility and other people had to join her in that imagination. So what if all we can hold on to is not definite answers right now, but our imaginations as we keep asking questions and dreaming new possibilities? In some ways, this is the gift of imagination that I have seen many kids and teachers and parents modeling right now, as their usual certain patterns and ways of doing school have been totally upended. They and we have had to use our imaginations for a new way. And this is what we are doing as a congregation when we are willing to totally change how we do church. I mean, 6.5 months ago, who would have thought? Here we all are, right? Even when that feels uncomfortable and we yearn for the safe familiar, that it is our imaginations that are opening us up to new ways of connecting. So what if one of the most important parts of our Unitarian Universalist covenant with one another is that we keep waking each other up to new possibilities? As soon as one of us gets really certain that there is only one way to do things or only one way to think, another one of us comes along and says, but how about we try this? That's part of living out our covenant with one another. As soon as one of us is sure that another one of us is wrong about something, how about we ask, can we find some truth in both of these ways of thinking? How might holding both these truths open us up to a new possibility. Our covenantal faith asks us to put real relationship with each other, our community, and the earth ahead of any loyalty to a creed or loyalty to any abstract side of an either-or coin. It asks us to let love override any thinking about the right or wrong way to do things. When we hold on to each other and to love, how might we be transformed? How might we imagine our way into a more loving and free life? So each day, friends, my hope is that we venture forth willing to imagine new possibilities. For that is our hope, and that can be our salvation. With imagination, we can get there together. May it be so, and amen.